During World War II, many companies worked for the Third Reich and used slave labor, as it was cheap and the Nazi Party determined who worked where. American companies Ford and General Motors had extended their businesses all over the world into a dozen nations, and those businesses operated serving both the Allies and the Axis powers. What were American companies doing working with Hitler and his war machine? How deeply involved were Ford and General Motors in Germany's production of war materiel using slave labor? How did these companies operate, producing war materiel to both the United States, its allies, and Nazi Germany? If German companies were punished after the war, what about Ford and General Motors?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former soldier, Marine Corps scout sniper, history professor, historian, and book author. And we will answer these questions and other issues on this segment of Forgotten History.
This post-war punishment and financial penalties have been applied to all the major German companies such as Volkswagen, IG Farben, BASF, Krupp, BMW, Daimler-Benz, the aircraft manufacturers, Siemens, and Bosch, just to name a few. All of them were on the financial hook for using slave labor. European industrialists such as Professor Willy Messerschmitt, Professor Ferdinand Porsche as examples, were all charged with war crimes for using slave labor. Not what they really had a choice in doing, but the American companies did. Both Ford and GM had established their companies in Germany and other nations, with GM buying Opel in 1931. After the war, both were subsequently charged with aiding and abetting the Holocaust, in essence playing both sides of the war for profit. In Germany, General Motors and Ford were critical in building and maintaining Germany's war machine. Heinrich Himmler ensured that the Gestapo maintained security at all of the Ford and GM operations, as well as German companies, for maximum effectiveness and security. In July 1938, following the German annexation of Austria, Henry Ford accepted the Grand Cross of the German Eagle. This was the highest medal that Nazi Germany could bestow upon a foreigner, and Hitler admired Ford's anti-Semitic outlook and kept an autographed photo of Ford, which he prized. However, Ford was not alone in receiving accolades, as a month later, the senior executive for General Motors in Germany, James Mooney, also received a medal for his distinguished service to the Reich. The major portions of their profit was the use of slave labor by the Third Reich, primarily under Reich Armaments Minister Albert Speer, who was in charge of war production. Ironically, one of Henry Ford's stipulations for hiring workers were no Negroes or Jews. It is the height of irony that tens of thousands of Jews built Ford products for Hitler. GM's plants in Germany, along with the other firms, built thousands of jet propulsion systems and vehicle engines as well as trucks under their brand name Opel, started by Franz von Opel, which they owned under license. Ironically, during the war, GM's American plants simultaneously produced aircraft engines for the American aviation industry. Researcher Bradford Snell stated that, quote, General Motors was far more important to the Nazi war machine than Switzerland, as their banks profited from the deposits of stolen wealth. However, GM, like Ford, was a critical part of the German war effort, and of 350,000 trucks used by the German army as of 1942, 1/3 were made by Ford, the other third made by GM. In late January of 1942, the Dearborn headquarters was informed that Ford's operations in France had the highest production level of all other manufacturers and, as summed up by the U.S. Treasury report, that they were still relying upon the French government to preserve the interests of American stockholders. This was divulged during the war due to secret meetings held in Lisbon, Portugal, between Robert Schmidt and Ford executives. Ford's Cologne manufacturing center used slave laborers from 1941 and 1945, mostly from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, but also many forced workers from France and Italy. One large part of this collective Ford and GM operation were the concentration camps, primarily Auschwitz, the largest camp where arrivals were selected, either for labor, the gas chamber, or in some cases medical experiments. But there was also another category, one necessary for the war effort. According to SS Lieutenant General Karl Wolff, quote, Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, had criteria for selection of prisoners. Those prisoners with any skills, such as metalworking, construction, any form of engineering, electricians, mechanics, medical training, anything that would aid the war effort were to be sent for labor under Speer." End quote. The Auschwitz records fell into Soviet hands after they liberated the camp in January of 1945. These files are detailed and supposedly contain the names of 100,000 forced workers located in the Moscow archives. Ford did admit under oath that its German subsidiary, Fordwerke AG, used slave labor in Cologne plant and was aware of it. Documents show that the parent companies followed a conscious strategy of continuing to do business with the Nazi regime rather than divest themselves of their German assets. Less than 3 weeks after the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, General Motors chairman Alfred P. Sloan defended the strategy as sound business practice, given the fact that the company's German operations were, quote, highly profitable. The purpose for both companies not closing down was to protect their investments. Ford and GM decided not to shut down their German factories after the war had been declared, as they still expected their profits from manufacturing, claiming they had no right to close down. GM also had its issues as part of its operations with the development of synthetic fuels, which became even more critical as Germany's access to petroleum slowly crumbled. When the U.S. Army liberated the Ford plants in Cologne and Berlin, they discovered the slave laborers and began taking statements. A U.S. Army report dated September 5, 1945, accused the German branch of Ford of serving as an arsenal of Nazism, at least for military vehicles, with the consent of the parent company in Dearborn, Michigan. Incredibly, after the war, both GM and Ford demanded reparations from the U.S. government for wartime damages sustained by their German facilities as a result of Allied bombing. In 1967, the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission of the U.S. Congress made a compensatory award, and Ford received a little less than $1 million, primarily as a result of damages sustained by its military truck factory at Cologne. Yet at no point during these proceedings was the use of the slave labor force even brought up. On March 4, 1998, a first-of-its-kind lawsuit was filed against Ford Motor Company, and subsequently General Motors also found themselves in trouble. After Switzerland's largest banks agreed in August of 1997 to make a $1.25 billion settlement to Holocaust survivors, which they had resisted for decades, a precedent was established. Holocaust survivors could be compensated for pain, suffering, and loss of material wealth and assets. The success of Nazi victims in obtaining financial reparations from Swiss banks, which had profited from Nazi wartime deposits, shook the financial world. Regarding Ford, the lawsuit claimed that Ford's German plant became an eager, aggressive, and successful bidder for forced laborers, and that senior Ford executives in Dearborn, Michigan were well aware of the fact. Ford's lawyers argued that the parent company lost control of German operations when the war broke out, and those assets were seized as enemy property, but Ford still took the money. Later, Ford corrected its initial claim that it did not profit in any way from forced labor, but only after documents surfaced that after the war, Ford received dividends from its German subsidiary worth approximately $60,000 for the years 1940 to 1943. Similar arguments applied to General Motors, which was paid $32 million by the U.S. government for damages sustained to its German plants, even though they made war material for Germany. The Treasury Department had investigated Ford in 1942 for possible illegal contracts and contacts with its subsidiary in occupied France, which produced German trucks under their Opel brand using slave labor, along with GM. The investigation ended without charges being filed, possibly due to the heavy U.S. government influence and the fact that Ford was making so much money for the American war effort, along with General Motors. Ford even called the former U.S. Secretary of State Warren Christopher as a witness to testify that former administrations had upheld the concept that governments, and not courts, should decide war reparations. Ford also argued that the statute of limitations on the victims' claims had expired, without providing any legal precedent. But if that were so, how could Nazi war criminals still be hunted without any such expiration or legal restrictions? Making this point was New York University law professor Bert Newborn, who represented the slave laborers and their families, when he stated, quote, "Time can never shield a war criminal. either criminally or civilly, end quote. Famed Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal agreed and said, "The perpetrators of these crimes, whether extermination or slave labor, have no legal relief, and therefore cannot expect any compassionate forgiveness," end quote. To Ford's credit, according to Simon Reich, who compiled Ford's World War II documents, he totally disagreed with any comparison with General Motors. Reich stated, quote, "Ford decided to take a very public, open, and transparent route. Any serious researcher can go into the Henry Ford archive and see the documents in paper form and have them copied. Compare and contrast to this with the fact that General Motors conducted a very private study and had the original hard copy documentation upon which the study was made and has never been made available, and today cannot be copied without General Motors' legal department's permission," end quote. Unlike General Motors, to their credit, Ford agreed to a $5 billion settlement and in 2001 added $2 million to compensate victims of slave labor. It also set aside $4 million for research on human rights and slave labor. So, the connections between American companies and the Third Reich is more transparent than most believed.
We hope you enjoyed this segment of Forgotten History. Please click like and subscribe for free. And please stay tuned and be engaged and informed. Send us comments if you have questions or even show ideas, and we will respond to all requests and comments as soon as we can. Thank you.